Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthologies. Written by Andrew Lucas and narrated by Melissa Del Toro Schaffner. Cormorant, Egypt, 1870. Patrick Cobb loosened his shirt, prying the white cotton away from his sweat-coated torso. He hadn't endured heat like this since his first tour in India. In many ways, Egypt was far too reminiscent of India, beyond the god-forsaken heat. He marveled at the ingenuity of the local workforce in adapting the temple remains as a makeshift dock for the Zeppelin. The desert elements were slowly dissolving the nameless limestone edifice. Many of the massive blocks, each the size of a canopied bed, had collapsed hundreds of years ago. The base of the temple was deeply embedded in the drifting dunes, and a scattering of blocks tumbled from what remained of the upper roof down the side of the desert hills. In the lee of the ruins, the Imperial Army had built their camp, a dozen or so canvas tents, and of course, an assortment of the accoutrements of war. A chaotic webwork of ropes and hawsers allowed relatively easy access to the summit, and the steel tower erected upon it. "It won't be long now, Mr. Cobb." The booming voice and its confoundingly ambiguous accent belonged to Alistair Horn, a purported Dutch national and owner of the vehicle Patrick had traveled so far to charter. The man was almost as tall as Patrick, but broader in the thighs and waist, no doubt, due to his rich diet and sporadic exercise regimen. Patrick smiled as Horn approached, marveling that the fair-skinned redhead hadn't burst into flame under the blistering desert sun. Horn climbed up to where Patrick perched, on a canted limestone block. He finally made it to the summit of the small edifice, huffing and puffing, his hands on his knees, struggling to regain his breath. Why do you come up here, when I have a perfectly good camp a few yards below, and in the shade?" Patrick glanced at the large, semi-rigid wooden and canvas structure at the base of the hill. He knew it was filled with the finest accoutrements and furnishings the bazaars of Cairo could provide, just as he knew Horn would abandon most of them to the sand when they left. For this reason alone, he despised the man. "Why are you here, Mr. Cobb?" "From here I can see for miles." Patrick pointed to an object just clearing the horizon. "Our transport is nearing." "Not here specifically, sir. Rather here in general, on this trip in particular." It was a valid question, though the man's peculiar diction and insistence upon using honorifics distracted Patrick. Perhaps that was Horn's intention, and it wasn't the first time Patrick had had this thought, imagining the foreigner was trying to pry into his affairs. It seemed every time he turned around, the plump foreigner was somewhere nearby. He'd found himself dodging Horn for the last few days as he secured provisions on the streets of Cairo. It was his nature to keep his business his own, and given his choice, he would have avoided Horn altogether given a choice, but there were only a few districts in the city that foreigners were welcome in. Always, Horn was there. Patrick glanced at Horn, then back towards the camp below. He could see the porters moving his crated equipment from the transport wagons and arraying them on the staging platform. Soon, he would have to descend from his vantage point and begin preparing the instruments. But for now, he was enjoying the view of the camp below. "It's a little high and unsteady for my taste, Mr. Cobb, but the panorama is without peer. Nothing in your United Kingdom rivals it." "My kingdom?" Horn stared intently at Patrick, as if trying to decipher his words from a foreign language. "I misspoke?" Horn swabbed his sweating brow with a coarse-woven cloth. Patrick recognized the material from a stall in the bazaar. A stall where he'd purchased his own small square of cotton. The pattern Horn had purchased was one that Patrick himself had picked up and then rejected as too garish. Was Horn playing games with him again? I took it from your bearing that you were a military man. With which unit did you serve? 4th Royal Irish Dragoon Guards. Patrick hadn't meant to respond to the man, but the instinct to respond quickly was ingrained in him after years of service. His long and inglorious service to the crown was of no concern to any but himself and the royal cashiers. What brings you to the Nile? An innocent enough question, and Patrick fought the urge to rebuke this sweating foreigner for the inquiry. I have a commission from the Royal Geographical Society to conduct oceanic studies of the Mediterranean coastal seaways. That sounds very, well, to put it delicately, dull. Horn waved his hand dismissively. All lead chain soundings, rude charcoal drawings of cliffs, and squiggly maps. Quite tedious. Anger flashed through Patrick again. I assure you, sir, that is not true, and doubly so for my expedition. My equipment is revolutionary, using light amplification and refraction to accurately plumb the depths of the sea. Horn looked intrigued, true interest finally piercing through his veneer of arrogance. And how do you accomplish that feat? Patrick smiled, enjoying the small victory. He pointed toward the horizon, where the huge oblong shape of an airship was descending through the clouds. The bulbous gray of the vehicle's main body was emblazoned with the crescent and star of the Ottoman Empire. From the sky, of course. The airship was surprisingly noisy. Not on the same level as a steamship or one of the new breed ironclads, but he had expected it to be quieter. This was the first time Patrick had been on an airship, more accurately, under it. Tethered to an equipment platform suspended from the ship's main gondola, he secured and calibrated a bevy of scientific instruments, each of which was uniquely constructed for his needs. To either side of him were paired sets of massive engines driving air screws, each spinning over 4 yards feet in arc. Luckily, the propellers produced their thrust directly behind them, and the equipment platform suffered little from any backwash. However, the sound was stunning. This wasn't the first ship Patrick had booked passage on, but those had been British naval vessels, complete with the first-rate engineering that came with that lineage. The Turkish complement of this airship had a more laissez-faire attitude to equipment maintenance than the Admiralty. Functional, but rough, in a way that annoyed his sensibilities. The engines were no exception. They knocked and sputtered in an alarmingly random pattern, and seemed to have nothing in the way of sound-suppressing equipment. At least within the body of the ship, the lower decks and the absorbent nature of the buoyancy bag muffled much of the noise, but not outside. A telescoping viewer attached to his sounding apparatus displayed an image of the desert a few miles along the line of the airship travel. Patrick adjusted the settings on the array of optical tubes running the length of the machine and then checked the results in the telescope. He was gratified to see the results and jotted a few calculations into a leather-bound notebook. It wouldn't be long now before he would see the full results of his labors. Only a few hours' flight, and they'd be over the construction site, and beyond that, the Strait of Hormuz. Only a few hours. A sharp jerk on the tether harnessed to his waist interrupted his thoughts. Patrick looked back toward the hatch where the rope was secured. A massive Turk was leaning out the hatch, one massive hand clutching the tether. Patrick met the man's eyes and held up a finger to indicate he would be just a moment. The Turk smiled and yanked again, making Patrick stumble forward a few steps before regaining his balance. Furious, Patrick untethered himself and pulled himself into the Zeppelin. "What's the bloody game?" The large Turk was there, filling the gangway with his bulk. Now that Patrick could see him fully, he recognized the soiled uniform of an airman, the long sleeves rolled up past massive biceps. He was keenly aware of the open hatch behind him and the loose rope coiled at his feet. He balled his fists and advanced, ready to take the man apart. Emek. The large man growled slightly and reluctantly stood aside, revealing a smaller man in the pale blue uniform of an Egyptian Yuzbashi, the British equivalent of captain. Patrick wasn't entirely sure of the chain of command within the Ottoman Navy, but he knew enough to recognize how unusual the man's presence in the bowels of the Zeppelin was. In many ways, Egypt held the same position within its empire as Patrick's home nation did. A lesser partner at best, a vassal state. At worst, an embarrassment. Mr. Cobb, allow me to introduce myself. The officer extended a dark, well-tanned hand. Reluctantly, Patrick took it. The man's grip was firm, and there were calluses on his palm that mirrors Patrick's own. A mechanic, or a saber wielder. Perhaps both. I am Yuzbashi Hamed Tora, of the Egyptian army. I have the distinct pleasure of serving His Majesty Ismail the Magnificent upon this great airship, and by extension, the mighty Ottoman Empire. A pleasure, Patrick replied, though he expected the conversation to be anything but. Tora moved past Patrick and gestured at the still-open hatch. Is it true that your imaging equipment can spot objects many, many miles distant? Yes. As far as the horizon, if not beyond, as so I'm told. Yes. And beneath it, I also hear. Patrick watched Tora, carefully considering what the man might say next. The Egyptian met his gaze inquisitively, trying to glimpse Patrick's thoughts. The scrutiny was intense, and after a moment, Tora nodded to himself, seeing what he wanted, and continued. Yes, Horn speaks often and freely, but in this case, it is to your benefit. How is anything that odious man says of any benefit to me? Tora smiled and pulled a sheaf of official-looking documents from within his tunic. Were it not for M. Horn's rather candid, dare I say, gossiping nature, I would not now be in the position to offer you this generous commission. Commission? I am already serving on the behest of the British Geographic Society. The Egyptian smiled, pushing the papers into Patrick's hand. Patrick didn't have to read Arabic to recognize a legal contract and the crest, making it an imperial writ. This document will show that the Imperial Navy has seconded your equipment for their use. Welcome to the Empire, at least for the next few days. I'm mapping coastlines. How is that important to the Turks? Tora frowned, unimpressed at Patrick's dismissal of his position. The Ottoman Empire is more than Turkey. However, be that as it may, your equipment is vital to this airship's mission. Again, how is my optical imaging and spectrum probe of any use to you? It is unique and delicate equipment that only I can operate. Then you shall do so in the service of justice. Justice? The Egyptian smiled widely, clapping the towering Turkish soldier on the shoulder. Oh yes, Mr. Cobb, justice. The pair turned and walked away through the underbelly of the ship. As they reached the ladder providing access to the upper decks, Tora stopped and turned back to Patrick. He was smiling. Justice. Tomorrow, we hunt Nemo. Tora was as good as his word. The next morning, he interrupted Patrick at his breakfast, barging into his stateroom. The eager man spread military dispatches and maps he had no doubt pilfered from the airship's bridge across the room's small table. As you can see, the pirate has been spotted here and here, off the coast of Portugal, Sicily, and now Turkey. Patrick looked over the map, the edge stained with grease from the sausage the Egyptian had dipped it in, as he enthusiastically spread the paper across the cluttered table. There was a string of marks on the map, each with a date and notation. The intelligence tracked something moving closer to the North African coast. The last was dated a week ago, and just off the Egyptian coast. What are these? Toda looked pensive for a moment, then answered the question, pointing at each location in turn. Here, a Portuguese freighter was struck beneath the waterline by something unseen. 2 days later, a British lookout at Gibraltar reported a half-submerged derelict moving across the current. A few days later, 3 fishermen from Algiers claimed to have spotted a humpback whale. Last week, an Italian frigate was sent to the bottom. I haven't seen any of this in the local papers. The Egyptian smiled. Nor shall you, my friend. It seems the papers have tired of this science criminal, regardless of how sensational his exploits may be. Patrick frowned. Captain Nemo's exploits, his one-man war against the world's nations, had been front-page news for the last 2 years, even when no one knew him. Unexplained accidents, oceanic disasters, and tall tales, all attributed to him. There must be a dozen or more notations on this map. How have you kept such a number of incidents, many with loss of life, out of the public forum? Surely the world has not lost its interest in Nemo's crusade. This is true, and while the public may be clamoring for such sensational fare, the government is under no obligation to share such intelligence. Which government? Patrick asked. Why, all of them, Mr. Cobb. All of them. The Renegade's activities have accomplished one thing at least, bringing the empires of the world together in one common cause. Patrick looked at the map and the many notations tracking the movements of Nemo's subaquatic vehicle. The cooperation and coordination between rival, even warring nations, was unprecedented. If this was the future, then perhaps Nemo was doomed. For how could one man stand against a league of nations arrayed against him? But these events have all occurred far from here, the last off the coast of Tunis. We're hundreds of miles away with the bulk of Arabia and Egypt between us. While Captain Nemo's machine is miraculous, unlike us, it cannot fly. This is true, but for many months now we have known that our adversary has access to subaquatic. Toda pulled at his beard, thinking about his words for a moment before continuing. Tunnels, in any event, connecting the warm Mediterranean to the southern seas. I see. And we're to use my apparatus to detect the vehicle when it reappears here, then? You know for a fact that the vehicle will appear here? Toda pointed at a point to the southernmost point of the Red Sea, where the lower tip of Arabia almost touched the African coastline. It was a relatively narrow stretch of sea, a choke point, if you will. Oh yes, for there is a much-publicized resupply of skilled labor traveling by merchant steamship through this channel in the next few days. Surely you have read of it in the papers, or heard the radio speak of it. Patrick had heard of the convoy of press-ganged laborers headed to resupply the ambitious construction project at Suez. Editorial opinion belabored the fact that these ships would be filled with slaves, criminals, or simply desperate workers. It was how empires are built. And you expect Nemo to attack these ships? Of course. It is his favored prey. The Egyptian rolled up his maps and collected his military dispatches. He turned to leave Patrick to the remains of his now cold breakfast, but he had one last thought to share. A successful egret knows where and when to strike. Patrick knew the egret was a common bird in Egypt, tied to the god Ra in their ancient mythology. It seemed his host might have a bit of a god complex to go along with his arrogance. And we're the egret. Indeed we are, my friend. Indeed we are. The Egyptian exited Patrick's quarters, and soon we shall feed. Patrick let the cord play through his fingers, careful to allow the tether to feed through the hatch without knotting or catching on one of the many places of equipment cluttering the equipment platform. A large spool held the thin but strong cord, allowing the tether to coil away from anyone wearing the tether's harness, but providing almost 1,000 foot of nylon rope to cushion any fall. Such a long tether allowed the wearer to work anywhere on the surface of the Zeppelin and served as a conveyance for boarding parties descending upon hapless ships from above. The platform contained a radio set, a mapping table, and a thick speaking tube connecting the platform to the bridge. Eventually, the cord went taut as the slack was pulled in and the bulbous shape of Alistair Horn struggled down the rope ladder to the platform. He looked about him with an expression of triumph, as if those few steps were an accomplishment worthy of praise. Perhaps, Patrick thought, they were. He'd known men, strong men, who had been broken by their experiences. Comrades who would be sorely tested by a simple rope ladder. Strong men are broken by their experiences. You never truly knew a man or what in his past defined him.
Mr. Cobb, what a marvelous morning!
Patrick unclipped the man's tether and secured it to the platform's frame. Behind him, Toda and Emick climbed onto the platform, each wearing a harness with a much shorter tether. The cords wouldn't catch on the equipment the same way Patrick's and Horn's did, but would necessitate that the pair clip and unclip themselves regularly to move around the platform. Patrick was thankful for small favors if it meant the pair would be out of his way.
Is this how you scry the depths, with this wonderful device?
Horn hunched over the rack of equipment that Patrick had painstakingly installed and calibrated the day before. He was haphazardly turning wheels meant for minute adjustments and watching the viewing screen. The screen swirled between images of the ocean surface and random bits of its floor. The only constant was a large marlin swimming contentedly within each scene.
What is this fish? I have not seen its like before, and how is it everywhere I look?
Leave that be, Patrick tersely commanded, pushing the portly man away from his apparatus. The equipment is delicate and one of a kind. Horn backed away, holding his hands up in apology.
I meant no harm. I'm attracted to all things mechanical, although I admit I've no aptitude with such things.
Patrick was annoyed by both his overreaction and the man's obvious attempt to ingratiate himself with such a sickly apology. He was mostly annoyed by his readiness to accept the man's words.
Fine.
This fish, what is it? This from Toda, who was now leaning in to examine the image on the viewer.
A marlin.
I have never seen such a fish in this area.
Nor shall you.
The animal is native to the Americas. I use its image to set scale and range. Patrick manipulated the filters and ranging tubes on his equipment, the fish shrinking or expanding on the viewer as he worked the controls. Horn pointed at a display above the device that had an assortment of tubes presenting a series of numerals.
Is that a radio?
Of sorts, Patrick replied. It transmits a position from our optical marker across select radio frequencies. It allows me to calibrate range and heading.
Won't that interrupt the airship's own radio communication?
No. The range and broadcast frequency is too narrow for any but the most sophisticated equipment to pick up. I see. Toda stroked his beard. An interesting concept. Is it accurate? To within 10 feet. More than accurate enough for our purposes. So once we spot Nemo's submersible, we simply provide the range and bearing to the bridge, and they will be able to interpret them?
Any halfway competent navigator will be able to fix a bearing from them,
Patrick replied, still fiddling with his equipment. Engrossed in his work, he didn't notice the anger that flashed across the Egyptian's face, or the knowing look he shared with the hulking Emick. Patrick stepped away from the viewer and pointed to the starboard side of the airship. Off in the distance, a pair of objects could be seen creating the horizon. Intrigued, Patrick turned his imaging screen in that direction. The objects resolved themselves into the dark shape of ships, a pair of squat vessels, which, while they sported 3 masts each, churn the water with massive paddle wheels. Funnels spewed black clouds of foul smoke into the air. Here is true scientific advancement. The best of the Ottoman Empire's navy, Hamidiye and Peak Sheref, fresh from the shipyards of Constantinople. They shall be paid to Nemo's butcher bill. Patrick recognized British shipwork when he saw it. Ironclad timbers sheathed their hulls, and massive, imposing reinforced rams cut through the otherwise tranquil Red Sea. They were an intimidating display of naval power. "Seems you have the situation well in hand," Patrick admitted. "But Nemo has eluded or sunk warships before. It seems he's quite good at it." Toda didn't respond directly to Patrick's comment. Instead, he leaned over the speaker tube and spoke a few short phrases of Turkish into it, then gestured back at the viewer. On the screen, the pair of warships slowed, quickly coming to a halt. Their decks were a flurry of motion as sailors rolled back huge oilskin tarps that Patrick had assumed were simply weather covering for the gun casements. He was surprised to see that the 6-inch gun emplacements had been replaced with a large black iron monstrosity. The crew used a portable crane to raise a massive shell into the weapon's dark maw. The crew finished their work and retreated below decks, sliding steel shutters behind them. A voice muttered from the speaker tube, and Toda pointed at a spot some distance from the two ships. "Now watch." A plume of fire erupted from each ship, propelling the thick shells high into the air. They arced in silence on the viewer, plunging into the sea about a half-mile from the ironclads. A second later, the distant boom of the weapons caught up to the image. It was louder than any cannon Patrick had ever heard before. Then, the viewer clouded over, struggling to focus through the tons of seawater suddenly thrown into its line of sight. Patrick rushed to the guardrail, scanning the horizon. There were twin plumes of mist shot high into the sky. The violence of the eruption was staggering. Such power was beyond belief. Then, the thunder of the explosion and the shockwave hit the airship, both deafening and shaking the equipment platform. All 4 men struggled to remain standing, but even though the platform shook tumultuously, they all maintained their footing.
Good God, man! What was that?
Patrick shouted, still partially deafened by the blast. Horn smiled, enjoying equally the spectacle of the weapon and Patrick's dismay. A gift from the Russian Tsar, retrofitted upon the casemate of those magnificent ships.
"You're doing?"
I facilitated the negotiations and collected a small commission, but it was my pleasure. It's what they call a siege mortar. It fires an 18-inch shell with 100 pounds of TNT. It makes a statement, does it not, Mr. Cobb? Patrick was stunned. He had never imagined a weapon with that much destructive potential, let alone seen one detonated. If they had been facing weapons like this in the Crimea, none of his old regiment would have survived. The carnage would have been unimaginable. The shells have an internal timer that ensures they will detonate far enough beneath the water for maximum water displacement. With these, we shall either crush Nemo or see him airborne. The Egyptian laughed, echoed by a deep chuckle from the usually stoic Emek, still looming over the other men. Patrick gathered his thoughts, busying himself with his apparatus to hide his dismay. Could this Russian wonder weapon spell the end of Nemo's crusade against the world imperialist expansion?
"What are you doing there, Mr. Cobb?"
"Recalibrating the equipment. The concussion has knocked it out of alignment." Horn watched Patrick adjust the dials and lenses of his equipment as the Egyptian officer gloated over the successful weapons test. "That is good. As you can see, we are ready for this submarine terror. As you can see, the egret is ready for its meal. Now, all we chum the water and wait for the fish to feed. The Suez resupply convoy will be here in a few days. The great work on the canal will continue once this inconvenience is removed.
"What is that?" Horn shouted, pointing at the viewer's screen. "Back! Take it back! There!" The image on the screen resolved into a slim, fast-moving object. The size of the object was hard to determine, but its shape was that of a predator, shark-like object, all iron plate, and projecting fins. It was fast, faster than any ship the four men had seen before, which was even more incredible, for all but the tip of it being below the water's surface. The way it cut through the water, leaving a minimal wake, was impressive. "It is him! The criminal Nemo!" Toda yelled, gesticulating wildly at the screen. "Focus that device! Get me a bearing!" The Egyptian officer scrambled for the speaking tube, dropping it a couple of times before getting it close to his lips. "The explosion must have attracted his interest," mused Horn. He focused on the image. "Can you make it clear?" Patrick looked at his equipment, twisted a few dials, and the image sharpened slightly, then, as quickly, blurred. Horn pointed at the screen. "You're losing him! The image is worse now than it was!" "The vessel has dipped fully beneath the sea and picked up speed. It's all I can do to keep it on the viewer. The beast's velocity is unimaginable, and it's only accelerating." Toda screamed into the speaker tube, switching from Arabic to Turkish and back again as he rattled out coordinates to the bridge. A muffled reply snapped back at him. "The captain of the Midia reports no contact. They see nothing in the water." Horn restored at the viewer, displaying the approaching underwater vessel just below the surface, but producing no wake from its passage. "It's underwater, you can clearly see that. It's nearly upon them. Fire! Fire!" Toda shouted into the speaker tube, and Patrick imagined the two ironclads clearing their decks for action. Officers and sailors scrambling for their positions, gunners lifting and loading another pair of shells, this time in panic rather than pride. Twin plumes of steam and water blasted into the air, and a few seconds later, the concussion rocked the airship. All four men scrambled for handholds, Patrick and Horn, both grasping the viewer as the Zeppelin bucked. Tense moments passed as the pendulum swing of the equipment platform settled down. "The submersible, the Nautilus, is it hit? Is it sunk?" Patrick swung the viewer's display, orienting it not on the path Nemo's vessel had been taking, but on the two Egyptian warships. The crew was frantically peering off their starboard and looking for remnants of Nemo's craft. "Why are you focusing on our warships?" Patrick spared a moment from adjusting his instruments to give Horn and his compatriots a wry smile. "You wanted to see Nemo's ship, didn't you?" How is this possible? Nemo was coming from this direction, miles away. Unless... Patrick hooked a finger at his equipment. "Yes, unless the image you saw and fired upon was nothing more than a phantom." "Then that means—" "Nemo was on another course altogether, drawn by your arrogant weapons demonstration." Toda slowly, deliberately drew his service revolver from its holster. "No, it means that you are in league with that devil Nemo! You, a British officer!" Patrick stood tall. Now was the time to come clean. They would have this knowledge one way or the other. He knew that his imaging apparatus was holding a bearing for the Nautilus to bring its weaponed prow to bear. Without this assistance, the submersible would be forced to surface to find its prey. Devoid of the water's protection, the vessel would be susceptible to the Turkish artillery. It was vital that Patrick keep the apparatus trained on the second ship. Yes, a British officer pulled from a subjugated nation, forced to visit horrors upon others in the Crimea, more than enough to test the humanity of any man and their allegiances to any so-called great empire. You betrayed us!" "No," Patrick sighed deeply. "You presumed to use my equipment, to use science to hunt science. You imagine yourselves kingfishers, birds of prey, fishing for Nemo." Toda raised his weapon, taking aim, intent upon dispensing Ottoman justice on the spot. But Patrick was prepared, his years of battlefield service allowing him to anticipate the placement of the Egyptian's shot.
He moved quickly, pivoting his body, and the bullet passed by him, ricocheting off the scaffolding behind him. As he moved, Patrick twisted the imaging mechanism so that it directed its powerful light directly into the face of the officer. The man screamed, dropping his weapon and covering his eyes against the light. The Egyptian stumbled back, hitting scaffolding so hard that his companions grabbed frantically at the metal poles to maintain their balance. Horn screamed as his foot slipped out into the open air, and Emick grunted, hitting his back against the metal. Patrick pushed his advantage. Lashing out with a foot, he kicked Horn in the knee and was rewarded with a sickening crunch as the portly foreigner collapsed in a heap, his screams rising in volume. Cobb knew his primary threat wasn't the shifty Horn or the blinded Tota, but he couldn't take the risk that Horn would strike him from behind. He dropped his foot down on the man's knee again, ensuring that he was incapacitated. It was a fast, brutal strike, and Horn passed out from the pain. And it took only seconds to complete, but they were precious seconds. Emick hit Patrick high and hard, driving him back into the metal frame. The blow compressed his chest, and he felt at least one of his ribs give way beneath the hit. Patrick struggled to regain his breath, but Emick was a smart fighter, pushing his advantage with a savage overhead blow that drove Patrick to his knees. It wasn't the hardest punch that Patrick had taken over the years, but it was close to it. The Turkish airman gloated as Patrick got to his feet, gasping for breath. One might have thought that the man was giving his opponent a fighting chance, enjoying the competition, but the man just wanted to look his victim in the eye as he beat the life out of him. "Kill him, Emick!" Tota shouted, rubbing vision back into his eyes. "Don't play with him!" Emick flexed his massive arms and pressed forward, but he'd given Patrick a few seconds reprieve, enough to let his opponent get his hands up, but not quite enough time to draw a full breath. Now he advanced to finish the fight, pounding at the expat soldier with balled fists. Patrick was ready, even struggling for breath. He was able to bring his hands up to protect himself. Emick pounded away, but was unable to penetrate the Irishman's guard. The man's technique was rudimentary at best, but his power was unmistakable. Each blow knocked Patrick from one side of the equipment bay to the other. The huge man pounded Patrick back and forth, his powerful blows taking their toll, but they were not enough. Patrick blocked 3 strikes, and Emick began to tire. Patrick took each in turn, losing less ground with each. Finally, he lowered his guard enough for the Turk to see the amusement in his eyes, and his broad smile partially hidden by his fists. "You have strength, I'll give you that, but no finesse." Patrick let loose with a flurry of jabs that blew through the Turk's guard like wind through Nile reeds. Each blow struck home, hard and true, setting the man back on his heels with their fury. Following up with a powerful right-handed thrust, low and up into the man's diaphragm, he toppled Giant in a heap beside the prone Horn. As a 3-time pugilist champion with the Irish Guards, he had defeated them both. Then he turned his attention back to his imaging machinery. He swung the imaging tubes until they again pointed at the last Turkish ship. On the viewer, the Nautilus turned once again, its prow facing toward the ship. The Hamidiye, the pride of the Ottoman fleet, frantically turned to flee, massive plumes of dark smoke billowing from its stacks, its screws churning the water as it frantically tried to avoid its fate. Patrick glanced over his shoulder, sparing a moment to regard Tota, who was trying to focus his eyes and his revolver. Patrick judged he had a few minutes before the man regained his eyesight, long enough for Nemo to finish his bloody work. The Hamidiye erupted in a maelstrom of shattered timber and shredded metal. Sailors were catapulted into the sea, their bodies ripped and torn by the explosion. A sleek iron-shod shape surfaced 50 feet from the wreckage, sweeping in a broad arc toward the second warship. The crew of the Pique Sharef panicked, most of them abandoning ship, while a handful tried in vain to reload the siege mortar before the submarine warship turned upon them. "You thought yourselves egrets, plumbing the depths for your prey. But truly,
You are cormorants, enticed by your prey, but throttled by your betters before you can swallow it. In turn, the Peak Sheriff also succumbed to the assault of the Nautilus without firing a single shot. It bucked and heaved, collapsing from within as Nemo's armored creation ripped its keel to splinters. The submersible reappeared from beneath the water, its work done. A volley of fire shot out from Zeppelin's gun emplacements, but fell far short of its target. The submarine circled slowly, drawing its bearing on the airship before moving inexorably in its direction. Even the best fishing cormorant will starve if the leather strap around its neck isn't loosened. Rivals' birds will take all the fish from a pond, their hunger unsated and insatiable, before they starve or turn upon each other. The submarine's deck peeled back, revealing a weapon unlike any the world had seen before. A weapon similar to the tubes and projectors of Patrick's own instruments, but on a scale many-fold larger. Deep within the mechanism was the gleam of an unseen light source. Toda, his eyesight regained, looked at Patrick and then at the approaching submarine now within sight, without the need of any mechanical enhancement. He saw the approaching submarine and the death its weapons would bring to the Zeppelin and all aboard. The Egyptian raised his weapon, intent on exacting revenge upon Patrick before the end. But he had to know. He lowered the pistol. "And you and Nemo are rival cormorants, Mr. Cobb. In your bloodthirsty arrogance, you judge yourselves the equal of the Ottoman Empire?" Patrick unclipped his tether and stepped up to the edge of the equipment platform. "Oh no, we're the throttle." Stepping backward, he thrusted the length of his tether to slow his descent enough, and for Nemo's sailors to retrieve him once their work was complete. Then he fell toward the welcoming waters of below. Thank you for listening. Can you believe we're moving into Season 4 of the Untold Tales podcast? I literally can't even believe it. We are so grateful, and you know we love our listeners, fans, and patrons. We'd love to serve more people like you, so please share this podcast with your friends and family and anybody who might be a sci-fi buff. I know that they'll love it. If you'd like to support the show for about 1 cup of coffee a month, you can go to the link in the show notes on every episode and find a Support This Podcast link from Anchor.com. It'll give you some options on how you can support all these great authors on this podcast, as well as myself and Jeff. And we hope that you love what you hear. Have a great holiday season and Happy New Year.